Okay, so welcome to the next video lecture. I'm hoping the camera angle's is alright. It's a bit hard for me to check it at this point. Hopefully I'm not too overwhelmingly right up in your face like usual. I'm going to talk about nuclear weapons today, and specifically the extent to which nuclear weapons and other forms of WMD are a significant threat to global peace and security, even to the survival of the species perhaps, or whether their significance is really only symbolic. So to begin with, short introduction. The phrase WMDs refers to weapons of mass destruction. So we're talking about any weapon that can create mass casualties in a very short space of time. So we're talking about chemical weapons, biological weapons, and of course nuclear weapons primarily. Nuclear weapons and the threat of nuclear war has become more prominent again in recent years, in particular due to the threats being traded over the past year or so between the President of the US, Donald Trump, and the North Korean Premier, Kim Jong-un. This is actually the first time Trump's threats of war, he's vowed to utterly destroy North Korea if needs be, if provocations, as he calls them, continue. And this is actually the first time the US has made a direct threat against a nuclear state since 1962. Of course, they've made many threats against non-nuclear states, but this is the first time a threat has been made against a nuclear state since 1962, which was, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis, during which period of about 10 days, people around the world were really very concerned that a nuclear war between two nuclear powers could be imminent. The fears are not quite so great today, but still there are fears that the growing tension between North Korea and the US could potentially lead to a nuclear disaster. Similarly, the growing tension between the USA and Russia that we've seen developing in recent years, with US and Russia sponsoring different sides in local or regional conflicts such as that in Ukraine and Syria, has also led people to worry about the danger of an escalation in which the two sides actually clash directly, which could, of course, then spiral into potentially a direct war, which could become a nuclear war between the two sides. So this issue about the threat of nuclear weapons is very prominent, become prominent again, probably more prominent today than it has been since the end of the Cold War. And I will argue that nuclear weapons are a significant threat. Nuclear proliferation is a significant threat, but I'm going to argue that it's particularly what's known as vertical proliferation, the build-up and development of nuclear strategy by the existing nuclear powers, and particularly the Western powers, that is the real threat, much more than the horizontal proliferation, whereby more states acquire nuclear weapons, which actually could potentially lead to a more peaceful world. So I've made that distinction there between vertical proliferation being a real threat, horizontal proliferation not so much. Okay, so to begin with, of course, the heart of the idea that nuclear weapons constitute a real major significant threat to humanity are, of course, their amazing destructive power. They've only been used, well, twice in combat. Some people would say once, because it was very close together in the same war. On the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The combined effect of these just two bombs was to kill about 250,000 Japanese citizens. And the devastation caused by nuclear weapons has three aspects. First of all, there's what's called the blast effect. As with any bomb, the explosion which will kill anyone in the immediate vicinity. Secondly, nuclear weapons have a heat effect. Thermal radiation radiates out from the blast, creating a firestorm of 1,000 degrees Celsius, traveling at up to 1,000 miles per hour. Again, this will burn anyone within that vicinity. And then thirdly, of course, there's nuclear radiation, the radioactivity that results that can actually cause birth defects and problems and so on for even generations after the bomb has been dropped. So these are the three kind of forms of devastation caused by nuclear weapons, and this is why many people argue that they're such a threat is because of their sheer destructive potential. Now, of course, since the days of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those bombs were dropped in 1945, right at the end of World War II. We've had, 70 years plus of development of nuclear technology since then. And we know even the thermonuclear weapons, as they were called, that were developed from the 1950s onwards, were already 2,000 times as powerful as the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. In fact, Daniel Ellsberg, he's a retired analyst for Rand Corporation, a very prestigious corporation. He used to work as an analyst. He was commissioned by the Pentagon, working as basically a war planner in the 1960s. And he had access to classified documents about the US war strategy. And he claimed that the documents he saw suggested that in the event of a war with Russia, or in the event of even a suspicion that Russia might be about to launch some kind of nuclear strike, the US plan was to immediately devastate with nuclear weapons, basically obliterate all of Russia and China, causing between 400 and 600 million deaths immediately. Right? So we're talking about huge destructive potential. What they didn't know in the 1960s, but scientists really came to find out more about in the 1980s, was the idea of a nuclear winter. They found that this level of nuclear war would have actually created and would create such levels of smoke as to block out about 70% of the sunlight from reaching the Earth's surface, with a devastating effect on vegetation. Ellsberg claims that would actually destroy all mammal life on the planet, of any mammal larger than about, he reckoned, the size of a squirrel. So it would wipe out humanity, it would wipe out, all many major, hundreds of other species as well, such a nuclear war. So this is the major argument, that nuclear weapons are this significant threat, is the sheer destructive potential of a nuclear war. In contrast to that, there are others who argue, well, nuclear weapons are not such a major threat, because the very power of them, the very destructive potential of them, actually effectively renders them unusable. As we saw in the last example, the US are unlikely to wage a nuclear war that would wipe out the whole of humanity, one would hope. So there's an argument, well, nuclear weapons won't be used, they're not going to be used, because they're so powerful, that their sheer power renders them effectively unusable on the battlefield. An attack, and especially therefore an attack on a nuclear power, an attack against a nuclear power that could trigger a nuclear response, also becomes unthinkable. So this argument suggests that the significance of nuclear weapons is really merely symbolic. That the possession of nuclear weapons is, if you like, a status symbol that renders a certain prestige on the country that holds them. It signals membership of an elite club, if you like, an elite global club with only a handful of members. I think there are today only about 9 that we know of nuclear states. So let's see, that would be the 5 permanent members of the Security Council: US, UK, France, Russia and China. And then since the end of the Cold War, since the end of the Second World War, particularly since the 70s and 80s, other powers have also developed nuclear weapons. So India, Pakistan, Israel, and of course North Korea. That's about it. Those 9 countries, as far as we know, are the only countries with nuclear weapons in the world. So possession of them puts that country in, as I say, a kind of an elite club, if you like, of high status, prestigious countries, arguably. There's a development of this argument that nuclear weapons are not really a major threat because they're unusable. There's actually an argument that they've actually made the world a safer place. Because what they've meant, if you look at the beginning of the 20th century, before nuclear weapons existed, twice in the first half of the 20th century, rivalries between major powers in the early 20th century led to all-out World War, in World War I and World War II. Proponents of nuclear weapons argue that the reason the rivalry between the US and Russia during the Cold War did not spiral into World War was the existence of nuclear weapons. That was the reason we've not had a World War III. because both sides realized that war between two nuclear powers would be so mutually destructive that neither side would take the risk of embarking on it. This is what's called the Doctrine of Mad, M-A-D, mutually assured destruction. In the Cold War, the US and Russia both knew a direct attack on the other would be suicide because of the nuclear response it would provoke. Both sides knew that they would both be destroyed, mutually assured destruction. So this argument goes further than saying, well, not only are nuclear weapons not a threat to global peace and security, they actually help to maintain and uphold peace and stability in the world. They guarantee it. However, this doctrine of mutually assured destruction downplays, I would argue, the very real danger of a miscalculation or an accident. There have been many incidents in the Cold War. It's starting to, even now, starting to learn more about how very close the world did come to nuclear world war during the Cold War. Most famously was the case of Able Archer in 1983. This was a NATO war games exercise, a huge military training exercise by the NATO countries that many on the Russian side believed was actually a build-up to a real attack on the Soviet Union. And so Russia was actually close to responding to what it believed was the beginnings of an attack on it with a nuclear strike. Again, Daniel Ellsberg has spoken, who's former planner for the Pentagon. He's written about the fact that in the 1990s, Yeltsin was urged by many of his military commanders, Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia, urged by many of his commanders to press the nuclear button in response to what was later found out to be a weather rocket from Norway, but was picked up by Russian radar as potentially a nuclear rocket coming for Russia. There have been many of these cases of radars picking up things like even flocks of geese, even clouds. Again, another time in 1983, radar detection beams bounced off a cloud in Russia, triggering what was perceived as the signal of an incoming nuclear attack. Now we now know that it's thanks to one man who was in the radar station. Had he followed protocol,